Hi everybody, I'm Rajesh Mirchandani, the Chief Communications Officer for the United Nations Foundation. And this week at the UN, countries from around the world have been presenting their own reports on their progress on the SDGs. So what did we learn and what does it all mean? Well, UNF's Executive Director for Global Policy, Minh-Thu Pham, and her team have been closely following the proceedings, and she joins me now. Minh-Thu, welcome.
Thanks so much, Rajesh. Happy to be here.
So how are we doing on the SDGs 3 years into the timeline?
In those areas that are the easiest, we're actually doing quite well, and those are mostly around some of the issues related to the Millennium Development Goals. But then in a lot of areas that are much harder, we're not doing so well. So for the first time in a while, world hunger is rising, unfortunately. We also know that we're not making much progress for those populations that have been affected by conflict. So migrants, refugees, internally displaced, and we need to do better there. And then lastly, I'd say on climate and environment issues. Those are clearly going to be quite difficult if we're looking at a sustainable development agenda. 2017 was one of the warmest years on record. We know that in terms of environmental issues, we have a lot of environmental targets that will be expiring in 2020, and we need to do a much better job at achieving those.
So that's really sobering. Let's think a little bit about how countries are actually delivering their progress. So this week, at the high-level political forum at the UN headquarters here in New York, some 46 countries presented their own report cards. Now, counting previous years, that means that we now have progress reports from more than half of the UN member states. So what are we learning about the SDG progress? And is there something that can give us, cause to be optimistic?
Yeah, it's actually quite exciting to see all of the enthusiasm of countries to come and present to other countries. It's a sort of a peer review process. And the countries that have presented have really shown their commitment to achieving the SDGs. Every country that has come forward has put in place mechanisms and processes within their government to try to achieve the SDGs. So I think that's really exciting. Secondly, there's a lot of energy around other stakeholders. So this is not just the responsibility of governments, but citizens, especially youth, which is incredibly exciting. Companies, industry leaders from the private sector, and civil society have really jumped in, and I think there's been a lot of momentum. This year, we've seen a record number of business leaders coming to the UN to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. The Business Forum yesterday was incredibly exciting, so really great to see that kind of enthusiasm. And then lastly, there's a lot of attention from local and regional governments. So New York City, the first city ever to do the voluntary, what they call a voluntary local review, to look at what the city is doing to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And you see a lot of other cities following alongside. And so really kind of localizing the SDGs to cities, to communities where the rubber hits the road is quite exciting, and there's a ton of energy around that.
So with all this momentum building, as you've just described, what are the kind of key challenges that we need to overcome to really kind of make progress?
Well, as I said, on those areas that are more difficult, we're not doing so well. One of the main reasons why they are more difficult is because in a lot of goals and targets, we don't actually have the data that we're going to need. In terms of disaggregation, we don't know what level and who needs to be targeted. We don't actually have the systems in place for collecting the data, the sort of data infrastructure. And a lot of that's not financed. So making sure that national statistical offices have the capacity, making sure that other sources of data are brought into this process and can be used to help us better understand how well we're doing. And the progress is really important. And there's a lot there that needs to be done. Some really exciting developments are also taking place. The Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data has just announced an inclusive data partnership to really focus on disaggregated data and getting at those who may be furthest left behind and ensuring there's a data infrastructure around that. But I think data is a major challenge.
When you say disaggregated data, you mean that it's not just 50% of people haven't got X, it's actually of that 50%, there's a huge proportion that are, say, women or children. It's actually being able to identify who are the most disenfranchised communities amongst the populations.
Absolutely. So if you look just on average, then you're going to see a certain level of progress. But if you look at those who are, say, the 10 or 20% at the bottom of that rung, who are they? We need to be able to understand who are they, and so we have to collect that disaggregated data to get there. And they are, as we know right now, falling behind. So to know who that is, and then who we need to target our policies and our finances toward. So data is the first challenge. Second, I'd say financing. So we've talked about billions to trillions. How do you make sure that we're using official development assistance, which is about $140 billion a year, to really broaden that out and leverage and bring in other sources of financing. And we know that the private sector has a really critical role to play. And so what I mentioned before, it's quite exciting that the private sector is right there and ready to, roll up their sleeves and really help out. But the financing challenge is incredibly big. And so how do we get there? So that's a big challenge. And a lot of very smart people are trying to figure this out. And then lastly, I'd say leave no one behind. So partly this is about the disaggregated data that we just talked about, but it's also about understanding what are the needs of populations. What do they actually want? Is it enough to just try to end extreme poverty and hunger? That's a big part of the equation, but there are also other needs that those who are left behind want, and we need to be able to ask them. We need to be able to really figure out how do we target our policies and prioritize those that are furthest behind. So for instance, if we wanted to look at universal access to health coverage, right? It's not just about reaching those, giving that access to coverage to everyone. If you really want to get it right, you've got to find who is the furthest person out there, who is the hardest to reach, and target your policies there first, because then everybody else will fall into line. And so leave no one behind right now is a big challenge. The silver lining on that is that as you look at the 46 voluntary national reviews this year, almost every country talked about leave no one behind. It's very much front and foremost in countries' minds and on the minds of citizens and people around the world. And now we're just figuring out how do we better do that. And I think it's quite exciting to see some of the momentum around it.
And in terms of figuring that out, on the data issue, on the finance issue, and on the ability to reach those left furthest behind, that's going to take real out-of-the-box thinking, no business as usual.
Absolutely.